You're all welcome to be seated. As I believe everybody by now knows, Debbie and I had the opportunity, along with Ingram and 11 other people, to be in Israel last week. And the focus and the purpose of that particular mission was very specific. It was to go and visit the people that we have a relationship with in Shar HaNegev, in our sister community, to bear witness to what happened before the inevitable and necessary cleanup and rebuilding process starts, to be able to actually see firsthand, not through somebody else, not through the media, but with our own eyes, what happened. And originally, the mission was to find out what it is that they need. And I think we were thinking about that in terms of real things, hard things, right? Shoes and coats and whatever else it is that they need. We found the answer to that question within the first moments of talking to people, and what they need is to know that they are not alone. That is their biggest need right now. I'm going to talk about some of the other needs and how they're being addressed, but for us here, that is where it starts. That is where our focus needs to be in terms of finding out how to make sure that our brothers and sisters who are there know that they're not alone. They are seeing everything through the eyes of the media, the way that the world does. And there were quite a number of people who said, all of America hates us. Because that's what they're seeing in the media. And part of our job was to go and be there and say, that is not true, and we're here, and we love you. And so that's where I want to start my words today, is understanding that was the mission of what we were there to do. It was a trip unlike any that we've been on before, and both Debbie and I have been there more than 20 times, and in a lot of different reasons, a lot of different ways. It was not a trip where we toured in the normal sort of sense of it. It was not a trip where we, did all of those touristy things that we do. When we went out onto the street to visit people, even when Debbie and I went to go and see our friend John, who owns one of the stores on the Midrachov, it was to be there and talk to him. And yes, we bought from him, but Debbie, you were there probably 4 hours because you were helping him sell, because you do that really well, right? Everything was different. Everything had changed. And some of that was by necessity, but some of that, to me, that was one of the more painful parts for me of that trip, is to know that the Israel that I knew is not the Israel that is there anymore. In much the same way, by the way, that the world in the United States pre-9/11 is not the same one afterwards. That's not to say that Israel won't find joy and won't find happiness and won't build and won't do all of those things that we want Israel to do, but we have to understand it is going to look different. And it is going to be different. As I wanted to anchor my words today in this week's Parsha, I started going through it at the beginning of the week and was hoping I was going to find something in this week's Parsha to be able to anchor to and to be able to use as a hook. And the reality is, the more that I read this week's Parsha, the more parallels that I found. And I want to reflect on that just a little bit, because it's going to get us to where I want to be at by the end of this talk. Our parsha begins with Joseph as a dreamer. That's how it starts. He's got his dreams, and he is loving life. He is best loved by his father. He's clueless to all the issues that his brothers have with him. He's got his beautiful coat of many colors. Everything, he is on the top of the world. And it is amazing as you read through this parsha how quickly his whole world collapses around him. How quickly things going from being there to being at the absolute depths, literally and figuratively, as he's in a pit and in jail. And it happens so fast. And we sort of take that for granted. We take that for granted on how quickly things can change. And that is the story of October 7th. It's the story of what we heard as we were talking to the kibbutzim who said that night on October 6th, they were practicing for a celebration for the 70th anniversary of the kibbutz. And they gave each other hugs that night, and they said goodbye to each other that night to get ready the next morning or the next day on October 7th to have this great performance and celebration, and none of them knew that it would be the last time that they hugged some of those people. That's how quickly things changed. And it went from the height of heights, right? Shar HaNegev, one of the reasons that we love Shar HaNegev so much is it represents the ultimate dream, especially with Ophir as the mayor. He was the consummate dreamer. He was the Joseph of our time, dreaming of peace, dreaming of this Park Arazim that was going to allow people from Gaza to come and to be in Israel and have a place to work and be able to bring money back into Gaza. And that was his dream. And it was shattered. We then move in this parsha to two moments of despair for Joseph. The first is when, he was going to be killed until one of his brothers finally said, hey, let's put him in this pit instead of killing him. And what was interesting is the Torah goes out of its way to say that the pit was empty. Now the rabbis come and say, well, the Torah says that, this is the classic midrash, the Torah says that because it was empty of water, because that's what those pits usually were filled with, but it was filled with snakes and scorpions. That's the traditional rabbinic midrash. But I think the rabbis, with due respect, may have gotten that wrong. I think the Torah was saying something about the fact that pit was empty, and when Joseph was put in there, he was utterly alone and cut off from the entire world. And the reason I say that is because the other pit that he is thrown into a little bit later in the story, after he's already been sold into slavery in Egypt, is jail. But jail wasn't empty. Jail had other people in there with him. And the difference between Joseph's experience in the pit, in that emptiness, in that solitude, in that loneliness, I think was different than his, as hard as it was for him to be in jail, especially for something that he didn't do, he was able to manage. The story of his life continues even in jail, whereas we hear nothing about him in the pit. It's as if it just stops. And the next thing we hear is he's taken out of the pit and he's sold. But his story, and we imagine there must have been lots of feelings and ideas and things that were going on in his brain, but it's silent. And the Torah then continues with the story after he gets out, but in jail, in another moment of despair, we not only hear the story, but if we think about it, the story couldn't have continued the way that it did without him there. It became a part of the future. It became a part of that story. And so the question is, what's the difference? Right? What's the difference? And the difference is that in that pit he was alone, and in jail he wasn't. And so what did he do in jail? What was Joseph's response to that tragedy? He sees these two people that had been thrown in there. And in Deuteronomy 40, chapter 7, it says that he asked Pharaoh's courtiers who were with him in custody in his master's house, saying, "Why do you appear downcast today?" He wasn't focused on himself. He certainly had reason to be in pain, reason to feel abandoned, reason to feel betrayed. And yet, he decided to act for the good of other people that were in there in his jail cell. And that, I think, is what I want, the message that I want to bring to you, because when we were in Israel, the pain and the shock and the betrayal and the horrors of lives and dreams shattered permeated every aspect of the community. There's no doubt. And yet, what we saw was a country and people stepping up and responding to support one another in a way that I'd never seen before. And understand that on October 6th, I had never in my life seen Israel more divided. Never. And I'm sure there are times, but in my lifetime, for what I've seen, I never remember Israel more divided on October 6th. And yet on October 8th, the unity and the way in which people stepped up for one another was breathtaking. It was breathtaking. And I want to, on this day of Hanukkah, I want to focus on that. And Sunday I'm going to focus on the pictures and the images and what it was, because it's an important story to tell, absolutely. And we need to know, and we need to be able to tell it. But today, I actually want to focus on the light. And I want to share with you some of the things that we saw when we were there in Israel. The people stepped up because the government didn't. And it actually doesn't really matter at this point what your political motivations are and your political views are in Israel. Everybody agrees that the government failed on that day. Everybody does. And there have been a number of government members who have taken ownership of that. Not everybody, right? But a number of them who have. But the government was paralyzed. The government was slow. Not just on the day of. Please understand, and we'll talk about this more on Sunday, right? The bombing started at 6:30 in the morning on Shabbat morning. The first infiltrations onto the kibbutz happened around 7:15 or so. They started seeing on the WhatsApp groups that there were terrorists in the kibbutzim. The army didn't get there until about 3. Now, that's not to say that there weren't people fighting and there weren't people who stood up. And again, we'll talk about that on a week from Sunday. But that lack of alacrity, that lack of responsiveness started on that day and continued afterwards. And so, people like you and me stood up. And they started, Debbie calls it Startup Nation 2.0, right? It's not the high tech, it's the low tech social action person to person. And they created all of these organizations, all of these groups of people that dealt with very specific needs. So one of the first things we saw in Jerusalem was something called a Hamal. Now, Hamal is a military term. It means an operational center, right? And yet this Hamal in Jerusalem recognized the fact that all of these people, and a quarter of a million people right now, are displaced and out of their homes in Israel, between the south and between the north, because we forget a little bit about the north, but there are people who are displaced from the north as well. A quarter of a million people are displaced. In the south, in Shara Negev, after 30 hours for some people in their safe rooms, they had 2 or 3 minutes to leave. Because when they left, they were still under fire. When they left, there were still terrorists that were in the area, and the army had gotten to them and was able to rescue them, but they didn't have time to sit and to pack a suitcase. And so some people, we had first night Hanukkah with the family, and the kids left without their shoes. And this Hamal recognized that. They recognized that the people need clothes, people need diapers, people need baby formula, people need all of these sorts of basic things, and where are they going to go? And so they created a place where people could come and get it. And it happened literally overnight, right? We usually say that in a figurative sort of way, literally overnight. By October 8th, people were starting to respond to these needs. And that in of itself would have been fantastic. And then you hear the human piece to all of this. When they started to realize, they're watching these people come who have lost everything, very often members of their family who are either killed or captured. And they're having to dig through these boxes of clothes to find clothes for their family. And that loss of dignity was something that they recognized and said, no, we need to do something different. So what did they do? They built a store. They created, it looks like a department store with shelves and things hanging. There's no checkout because everything's free. But it gave people their dignity back. To be able to go and to pull something off of the shelf or pull something off, try it on in a dressing room, and then feel like they have some of that dignity. These chamalim popped up all over the place. All over the place. The second place that we went and saw that was really amazing was in the sort of the center coastal area of Israel called Rishpon. And it was a healing center, for lack of a better word. What did they realize after a couple of weeks? This took a little longer for people to realize, was the kibbutzim who are now displaced are scattered throughout Israel, but they're relatively together, right? In the main centers where these kibbutzim are, I would say 50 to 70% of the kibbutz are there. And some people went to family houses if they had them in other parts of Israel, and some people scattered a little bit, but the kibbutzim stayed together and they had one another for support. But the survivors of the Nova Festival, which was one of the hardest hit, more than 300 people died at that Nova Festival. They sort of scattered and went throughout Israel all alone. Each one, and most of these were young people in their 20s. They had no support. They were completely isolated, and they were truly suffering. And so they created this center in the middle of the country where these people could go and find A, each other, and B, healing. There are therapists that are literally roving and walking around and just talking to people. They'd sit. If you want to talk today, great. If you don't, they'll move on to somebody else. There was massage, there was sound healing and yoga and all sorts of things that our wonderful millennial Gen Z kids need, right? We do too, but they need it in a different way, right? It was all there for them. One of the areas, and for those who didn't speak Hebrew, we had to point it out for them in our group. There was an area right in front of sort of the massages, and it was just an area where people could sit, and there was a sign there that said, Kan mutar livkot. Here, it's allowed to cry. We sat down with a bunch of people who were singing and playing guitar, and we joined them, and we sang with them. There was a man who a number of us spoke with who lost 2 daughters and a grandchild. And he's probably in his 60s, I would say, Deb. Is that about right? And he's there every day because he needs a place where people understand and can relate to what he's going through. And again, this is not a government program. And not only that, it was at a place that sort of had an institute and some buildings, and the neighbors on either side had land that was really unused. And anybody who's been to Israel knows that, especially in the larger areas where you have larger areas of land, you've got the part of land that you're using and the part of land that you're not, right? And they had this land, and one of the neighbors said, you know what? Take this land and build on it. Use it for this. And the neighbor on the other side, not to be outdone, said, yeah, me too. Right? And all of a sudden, the neighbors donated this land, and the area that they had tripled for these people. The last organization, the last piece that I want to share with you is we visited on Thursday. We were heading to Tel Aviv, and we visited with the organizer and head of an organization that used to be called Achim Laneshek. Now, for those who were following Israeli politics prior to October 7th, you know that Achim Laneshek was actually a controversial organization. That was the group that started, the head of this was a fighter pilot, a former fighter pilot. That was the group of reservists who said, we are not going to serve. We are not going to go into reserve duty because they were protesting Netanyahu and his government and the judicial reform that was trying to happen. This was a purely political and very controversial organization. And they were sharp, and they were well organized, and they had close to 50,000 people on their email list to be able to, and they were part of all of these protests and all of these things that we saw happening in Israel. These people were the core of that. And as soon as October 7th happened, that day and the next morning, an email went out to every single person in that 50,000 list and said, we are serving. But what was more amazing is on a dime, they changed from being a political protest group to being 50,000 well-organized volunteers. And they started stepping in all of these places on those first few days, whether it be bringing soldiers from one part of the country to the other, because the military didn't have the ability to do that, to get everybody to where they needed to go. And so they were shuttling people around. They started working with these other hamalim and bringing food and bringing clothing and starting to move people out, to evacuate people from that area once they were able to leave and take them to where they needed to be. And 2-3 days later, there was a group of 50,000 people whose purpose 3 days before that was to stand up against what they perceived as an unjust government and to some degree the larger community who may have been supporting that. And overnight, that changed. On the one hand, I had never seen Israel that way. On the other hand, we've always seen Israel that way, right? We've always seen Israelis step up in ways to support one another that we actually don't see in the rest of the world. We really don't. And step up, frankly, for the rest of the world. We met with the head of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital. And we had heard him before. This time he was speaking about how they were dealing with the casualties and all of that. And we heard, but before, when we had heard him, he was the one that organizes the field hospitals that goes to all of these countries when they have a disaster. Because that's what Israelis do. I went expecting to see the things that I'll talk about in a week. The destruction, the violence, and the horrors that happened on that day. I went expecting to see that. This surprised even me, to see how quickly and how deeply Israel stood up for one another and with one another. And we had a number of people over for the first night of Hanukkah, and there was a woman who, what was the prize she won, Debbie? She won actually one of the big prizes in Israel. I don't think it was the Genesis Prize, but it was one of the big prizes. What, do you remember? And she spoke, and she said, there was a lot of surprises that happened on October 7th. Hamas surprised us, but we surprised Hamas. She said Hamas was expecting us, because of what was going on October 6th, to crumble and to fall apart. And instead, we created a unity stronger than any that Hamas has ever seen. And there was a fierceness and a pride as she spoke about that. I'll end with the way our trip ended, which was very summative, I think, of the entire trip. Debbie and I stayed for Shabbat afterwards. We didn't feel like we wanted to rush and fly and try to get here before Shabbat and deal with all of that. So we stayed through Shabbat, and we met with some friends of ours who used to live on Nahal Oz. Now they live on Kibbutz Bar Chayil. And we went on Saturday night to Hostage Square, which is in Tel Aviv, and it's where Saturday night there are weekly demonstrations since October 7th to bring the hostages back. It's where that original table of the empty place settings with the pictures of the hostages was set, and now throughout the world there have been other people, but this was the original place in front of the Museum of Art in Tel Aviv. And we heard people singing, and we heard people speaking. It was actually the first time that some of the families of the hostages spoke at this. And at the very, very end, we sang Hatikva with 6,000 other people. And Debbie and I looked at each other and said, That's the way to end this trip. And we got into the car, and our friends took us to the airport and dropped us off. And we checked in our luggage, and we were just about to go through security. We literally had put all of our hand luggage onto the conveyor belt to go through the X-ray machine, and a red alert goes off because the ceasefire had ended. And they were shooting rockets into central Tel Aviv and towards the airport, towards Ben Gurion where we were. And so we grabbed everything and walked with everybody into the staircase, which is the reinforced area, and waited for, well, first we heard the double boom of the Iron Dome intercepting the rockets that were above us, and 10 minutes later, we all got back out and put our stuff back onto the security line and went through, and Debbie and I looked at each other and said, say it again? Well, yeah, we all had to wait for the security people to go through security first, because they had come out as well. So they had to go through first, and then we got in line, and then we were able to go through. But we looked at each other and said, that's the way to end the trip, because that's the reality that is still in Israel. We're going to be talking a lot about dreams, and we've been hearing from our partners in Shara Negev, when the dreams are destroyed, how do you dream again? And it may behoove us to read carefully the story of Joseph and how his dreams were, on the one hand, shattered, but on the other hand, ultimately came true and realized in a way that even Joseph, I don't think, could have imagined. That is where I leave us today, with this idea that the Israelis are ready to dream again. They're in pain, they're suffering, they need to get the hostages back first. But we've heard from person after person saying, oh yeah, we're going back, and we're going to build it. Not only that, we met with somebody who's created an organization to start to work and said, this is our time, and we're going to build it so that Shar HaNegev is a place that everybody's going to want to come to. And whatever we can do to help in that dream, we will. Shabbat Shalom.